So I wrote this paper for my dear history professor, Lori. I've never met her before, so I thought that I could meet you via this video. Shall we start? This is the website analysis I did on two Parks Canada websites. One was about Fort Anne and the other about Grand Pré, but I'll get to that here. This paper will be inspecting two historical sites in Nova Scotia, Fort Anne and Grand Pré, as Parks Canada presents them online. Throughout, I will be explaining what it was like for me to experience the websites and the history behind them while briefing on some of the interesting information I found along the way throughout my virtual tour. Along with answering some questions outlined in the assignment, this paper will include explanations of the most enjoyable and laudable aspects of the two Parks Canada websites, and whether or not my reading about Fort Anne and Grand Pré has convinced me to take a trip to see for myself these two historical sites in Canada. I have never been to either in person. The website I decided to explore first was Fort Anne. After visiting the online site over again, I came to realize that it was the photography and art that I could hold an outlasting appreciation for on a personal level. The site presented more than that, though. It included detailed information on the people and events of the time. This is something the Grand Pré and Fort Anne websites have in common: their eye-catching visual displays and careful descriptions. The photography and artwork presented on the Fort Anne site kept me coming back for more than a first glance, and the historical facts displayed with images and the graphic design possessed an engaging layout. When it came to the in-depth facts on cultural heritage, the people, and the history of the place, the Fort Anne website opened a time portal that allowed me to travel back into the past and see things with a different eye, a fresh perspective. While viewing what 17th century Nova Scotia was like, I dug up some background stories on the people who lived there. Doing so, I got to see not only what it was like for them, but also how they helped to shape the history of their province and what is now our province. In Nova Scotia's earliest stages of the settlement and development, not everything was peaceful. But at the same time, the province was not always inflicted by war. The years between the centuries of the 1600s and 1800s were years of conflict between Britain and France, one that had marked history since William the Conqueror of the 11th century. But this particular conflict started and continued over control of East Coast Canada, a struggle that led to deporting thousands of women, men, and children, the French Acadians. The constant struggle for land and who would own what did not draw the line between two countries, however. This battle lived on in the hearts of men who could both be from Britain or France. Men made opponents, sometimes without an excuse of being national enemies. In the cultural heritage sections under the heading Natural Wonders and Cultural Treasures on Fort Anne's site, notable people mentioned included Charles de Manu d'Aulnay, Jean Motin, Samuel Vetch, Jean-Paul Mascarene, Francis Nicholson, and Rose Fortune. They were covered in their own little sections. I have a link included that you can see on the paper format. And it is demonstrated how their lives influenced their times, sometimes even the other way around, with the times they lived in affecting them. An example of this, exterior threats being beyond a person's control, can be seen in the account of François Marie Jacqueline, Madame de la Tour. While her husband Charles de Saint-Étienne de la Tour, who had an acrimonious relationship with Charles de Manu d'Aulnay, was away, d'Aulnay besieged the fort Madame de la Tour was defending. She soon took his offer of peace, but he lied to her and made her watch as the men under her care were killed before her eyes. Only one man survived. That man was the executioner. Weeks later, François Marie died. Although the Fort Anne website does not tell us the reasons of her death in 1645 at the age of 43, she died from what the government of Canada has termed unknown but probably natural causes, quote-unquote. Her husband, Charles de la Tour, was given word of the invasion, a pillage of vengeance, for his burning of d'Aulnay's fort, and his wife's death after the hangings at Fort Ste. Marie. La Tour later moved to Quebec. Throughout all the stories given at Fort Anne's site, François Marie Jacqueline's is a tragedy that moved me most. Woven within its narration is a thematic story of love, war, revenge, honor, deception, and greed. Not only does it tell of two Frenchmen attempting to checkmate each other for power of estates, but it also demonstrates just how far men would go for that power. Men whose country was one and the same. The story of rivalry between the Charleses does not demonstrate the war between England and France. It is one between two men who chose to fight over who would come out first. Their reason was power, and their motive, land. The people who lived at the Fort Anne National Historic Site are what Parks Canada refers to as, quote-unquote, the famous and almost unknown, end quote. They're the ones our history books only mention and whose stories go untold to the majority and quickly forgotten by the few. We as historians are assigned a project to restore the past by making the almost unknown present and retold so our history and culture can be remembered as part of our heritage. The Cultural Heritage section under National Wonders and Cultural Treasures, as well as highlighting the unnoticed, focuses our attention to the French-English struggle. The fight between France and England took place in two hemispheres, on two continents, and was not one of complete verbal nature. It was a violent campaign. Fort Anne, however, did not go unaccompanied in its experience with tragedy. Port Royal faced an attack in 1613, where the 150-year-long war between the English and French began. Then there was Grand Pré, a site settled throughout the years of 1682 to 1755. Although it may not be Canada's oldest historic site, Fort Anne is, it is largely significant for being home to the Acadians. Grand Pré, the place the Acadians called home, was also the land where they became exiles. From 1755 to 1762, the Acadians suffered a process of expulsion by their English neighbors. The eviction of the Acadians from Grand Pré is better known as the deportation. As an historic site, Grand Pré reminded me of museums I have ventured in and around as a child, the kind with workshops, reenactments, and model dikes, or what the French Acadians refer to as abattoirs, the plural term for the sluice gates of the dikes they built, or any such dike systems with sluice gates built within them that allowed the Acadians to control the water passing through. Grand Pré houses all of the activities mentioned above, so it is a family-friendly place. A similarity it holds with the Fort Anne site, which accommodates teachers and educators and encourages field trips for social studies or language arts. To go and spend the day, learn about the Acadians and the history behind Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Evangeline, A Tale of Acadie, 1847. The main attraction of the Grand Pré National Historic Site is its Evangeline sculpture. The outdoor effigy depicting Longfellow's Evangeline has to be inspected and polished by Parks Canada conservators in a 3-stage process: cleaning, waxing, and buffing, to avoid erosion beyond repair. This conservation process is performed every 2 years, so the outdoor statue can be preserved and continue to represent the Acadian tragedy with a polished appearance, free from the wear and tear of the elements it faces year-round. The epic poem of Longfellow is not, however, the only literary piece Grand Pré features in its historic setting. Winslow's journal, dated 1755, is another inspiration of restoration for the Acadian legacy. Together the two, one poet and one journalist, helped to set the mood and mark the spot where the Acadians once lived and where they were deported. Another monument at Grand Pré includes the Urban Cross, bought in 1907 by John Frederick Urban, which was placed in the spot of an old cemetery and erected for preservation of the Acadian history on what was their very own soil. Grand Pré Rural Historic District consists of several thousand acres of marshlands, uplands, farms, orchards, and villages. This Parks Canada site accredits today's Grand Pré landscape to the agricultural traditions of the Acadians and the planters, quote-unquote. Grand Pré's activities include, quote-unquote, a multimedia theater presentation, end quote, and an exhibit hall educating visitors on the history of the deportation, dated 1755 to 1762. With a reservation, school students can attend workshops that involve costumes, mystery solving, and analysis of the deportation in a child-friendly environment. What makes Grand Pré a significant site for history, and what the entire site is devoted to, is remembrance of the Acadians who started their lives on the colonial earth in 1682. While exploring both sites, I took some souvenirs back with me, tokens of knowledge, lessons I had not learned. At Fort Anne, I found out that in 1854, the place had been abandoned by the English, and it was not until 1917, after Canadians had pleaded the government to reserve it, that the Fort Anne site we can now appreciate today was restored. I also got to see some interesting things and find out other careful tidbits about both places. For instance, featured in the office quarters at Fort Anne is a handcrafted tapestry, designed by Kyoko Grenier Seiko. It was woven by over 100 volunteers and consists of roughly 3 million stitches, length 8 by 18 feet. A fun fact on the Grand Pré site is that the word Grand Pré can be used to describe any geographic region that contains uplands, farms, rolling hills, and marshland, as long as it includes several thousand acres. Both websites are filled with incredible facts that I could spend pages writing on. Grand Pré and Fort Anne's need a book written about them. There are pamphlets and history books. But I will end this paper with one final statement. Maybe two. No matter what Parks Canada sites you go to, make sure you see Fort Anne and Grand Pré. The first because it is the oldest site in Canada, not just in the Annapolis Valley. The second for its breathtaking landscape and for being the grounds where the Acadians originated. In the end, the Fort Anne website was the one I found the most beneficial, for its biographical information was valuable in my research. It was a close tie between the two. Oh, can we continue? Okay. I also have a timetable that I have presented for you. It is something that helped me as I researched and studied about this. So, Nova Scotian history via Fort Anne and Grand Pré Historic Sites of Canada. I have some timetable that I will show you maybe in a little future. In 1621, King James I of England granted the charter to Sir William Alexander, allowing Scots to settle North America. 8 years later, 1629, the Scots came, the French came, and the English continued to fight Charles I. Trying to appease France, he ordered the Scots out of there. In 1632, Scott colony belonged to France under the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Although this is a quote from Nova Scotia is Born, you can see it on a link that I will include. Although the Scots settlement was short-lived, it left an enduring legacy. The name, flag, and coat of arms of Nova Scotia are all derived from this venture. 1713, Treaty of Utrecht gave Acadia to England. War not over. 1755, the great upheaval of the Acadians. 1755 to 1762, Acadian deportation of approximately 10,000 Acadians. 1763, Treaty of Paris concluded the French-British War. 1854, British withdrew garrison from Fort Anne, Annapolis Royal, leaving it to fall to the ground. 1917, Fort Anne preserved, became Canada's first administered National Historic Site, quote unquote. That makes it today's oldest.